I apologize first because my talk is about 15 minutes long. And it is. And it had to be actually 14 minutes and 47 seconds when my wife timed because I wanted to keep it under the 15. But when Phil asked me to talk about history, I can't imagine any way to talk about it in less than hours, actually. But anyway, good afternoon. For a celebration like this, age is certainly a relative concept. As I ponder why Phil asked me to give this talk, I scan the crowd and see that I'm older than most of you in the back rows. I'm also fully aware that I started my career well before most of you were born. While I feel pretty good, I'll paraphrase an often heard sentiment, I should say. My brain feels like I'm in my 30s. My body often disagrees. My last point relative to age is I was present at the 100th anniversary celebration. The 100th anniversary of the department 50 years ago, so to be here for the 150th is quite an honor. At the 100th celebration banquet, I was a few months out of the academy. I think it was about 4 months. I, along with another officer, were assigned as the doorman to sit there, and they said, "Look pretty," so we did. We did our best anyway. We were rewarded with a dinner and a commemorative plate that we still have hanging up with all my police stuff. Chief McCullough, for the banquet coming up later this year, I know of 2 outstanding replacements for the position I held back at that time 50 years ago. You might guess who I'm going to say. Sergeant Joe Robinson and Sergeant Chris Robinson. They certainly have the genes for it, and they will not disappoint you. And I will make sure they're on time. Now, for the purpose of what Phil asked me to talk about today, a little historic perspective. I'm somewhat of a history buff, and I'll be repeating a little bit of what you heard. I appreciate history in that it shows us how we got to where we are today. It helps us prevent mistakes, and it also helps to appreciate how far we have come. While in the cadet class, we occasionally had to use high-tech manual typewriters. I started that cadet class in 1971. Fortunately, with that high-tech manual typewriter, a fellow cadet, now retired Captain Roger Sheets, taught me how to use the typewriter. He went a step further and taught me how to change the ribbon in a typewriter. My first assignment was in Central Records as a cadet with Cadet Tom Vargas, who many of you may know. And later, I was assigned as a cadet to the chief's office. I was often called the chief's driver. While I rarely drove him, there was an occasion when I vividly recall a conversation with Chief Enzer. He told me that his dream was to have the starting salary of a police officer at $10,000. I was stunned. I was making a little more than $5,000 at the time. I was astonished that such a salary might be possible someday. I must have slowed the car down a little bit because the chief, in a very exaggerated way, told me to push on the gas pedal and get moving. Mentioning the chief's office reminds me of another high-tech item we had at the time. It was the departmental roster in his office at the old Kenilworth headquarters. A label maker was used to identify every section and division of the department. I see Colonel Rogers shaking his head. He's seen that, and I wish I had a photograph of it. The label was affixed to a magnet and placed on the metal wall. They were color-coded to identify vacancies, rank, as well as every section and division in the police department. At a glance, you saw the entire department. As a cadet, that was part of my job. This wall reminds me of another story. The wall also served as a disciplinary tool. A cadet was driving a little loudly in front of headquarters on Kenilworth one day while he was getting off work, leaving Central Records. It was witnessed by Sergeant Donald Shriver, who some very old-timers would remember. And the next day, the cadet was called to the chief's office. He was a little nervous until he walked into the chief's conference room, and then he became terrified when he saw Chief Enzer remove his name from the board, motioning as if to toss it in the trash can. After, of course, making this point, he allowed the cadet to place his name back on the board and resume his career. That career finished at the rank of captain many years later. So as not to embarrass the captain, I'll just say his initials were R as in Roger, S as in Sheets. And he did give me permission to do that, and he also asked me to convey his best wishes to the department. My academy class was the 46. We graduated in January of 1974. It included the first female officer hired to work patrol. It was Officer Joyce Cheney. Prior to that, females were hired only to be given investigative roles, not for patrol work. Indeed, times have changed, so bear with me as I go through a list of the department equipment, technology we had at the time of the 100th anniversary, so you might appreciate it 50 years later. Let me preface my comments by saying that I had a career I would not trade for any other. I'll be talking about changes the department had in equipment back in the day. It would be wrong to interpret it as complaining, far from it. My philosophy in doing the job was not to focus on what latest gadgets or technology we might come up with, but in doing the job with what we had. And at that time, we had no concept of what could be coming 50 years later. Progress is and has proven to be inevitable, but the reality is that it does not happen immediately. So let's talk about 50 years ago. The patrol uniform we wore was what the honor guard is wearing today. It's exactly what we wore on patrol, Sam Brown belt and all. It's not practical to wear that nowadays with the equipment that police officers have to carry, but I will say appearance does make a difference. We wore white long sleeve shirts year-round and ties year-round. Communications did not exist in terms of the 911 center. We had a headquarters dispatch center in the old Kenilworth building in the corner of the building. When a call was received, basic information was taken and put on a card by the person answering the telephone. The person would take that card, go to a carousel of books over the size of a telephone book, look up the address and identify the police car number that handled that area. That person would then put that card on a moving track. The track would go down the course to one of three dispatchers, East Patrol, West Patrol, and Central Patrol. I heard a story once where somebody sent the card down and took a match to it to kind of wake somebody up. But I don't even know the names of those people, so no risk of embarrassing those folks. An actual early dispatch console is on display at the museum. I hope you get a chance to look at it. We went from pagers with a beep signal that notified you to call dispatch to find out what the message was. Then the great advancements was a pager with texting capability on it. I was issued my first cell phone as a major. It was a shoebox type phone, big thing, really, confiscated from a drug dealer. We had ink prints versus digital. You had to take the glass, roll the ink on this pad of glass, roll each individual print, then transfer it to a paper print, not once, but 3 times. County card, state card, and federal card. A lot of you still remember that. It wasn't all that far back. There was no DNA capability, no desktops, no laptops. The IBM computers were in their infancy. They were programmed with high stacks of IBM punch cards. Most of you probably don't remember that, but I remember the guy who was working back at that section carried them literally big stacks, armfuls, to go and do what he had to do with it. They were programmed to do crime analysis. Cars. We had no air conditioning in the cars that were still around from the mid-'60s to the late 60s. No AC at all. No AM, FM radios. Lights and sirens. We had one rotating red light on the roof of the car. That was it. Nowadays, a police car going down the road looks like a Christmas tree. Everything lights up in every direction imaginable, so much so that you really can't tell sometimes which direction it's coming and going. Lights everywhere. The car numbers were different. We had a series of 100, 200, and 300 to correspond with Western Patrol, Central Patrol, and Eastern Patrol. The siren was activated by pushing on a horn after changing a switch. The siren had only one tone. Sirens nowadays, you can sound like an orchestra going down the road with what they can do with those things. An upgraded version of the siren was a cone-shaped device on the roof of the police car. It was great except for when it snowed. When it snowed, the snow would become compacted in the cone, and the sound of the siren was reduced to a mere hum, and that's all you heard in the car. That worked. Radios. We only had one radio attached to a police car. You had no radio to carry with you. Any call you went to was without the benefit of it, and we had 3 channels, East, West, and Central. Another channel was for a talk-around group. It was pretty good. The system was fine until we were interrupted by what we called back in that day SCIP. SCIP was a police department in Louisiana. Their dispatch would come across our radio every bit as clear as their own dispatchers. A little while later, each precinct received 1 repeater radio. It was a handheld and would transmit from your handheld to your car and then to headquarters. Old-timers didn't use it, so it was always available for rookies. Old-timers didn't use it because they didn't want to be tethered to something to communicate with. We did not have body armor. When it was issued, it was a front vest only. Our weapon was a 6-shot revolver with 12 extra bullets conveniently located on the gun belt. Those bullets were brass. We had to polish those, and the reloading was 1 at a time. So you had a total of 18. No helicopter. Aviation was started by a police officer who leased his plane, as I understand, for $1 a year. No Marine unit. That was also started by a police officer. The first hostage negotiation team vehicle was an old Ambo. No ear protection at the range, which might explain why I frequently ask my wife, Barbara, to repeat things. No law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. We did get it in the early 70s. It's gone now, and I'll get back to that later. Academy classes were about 16 weeks, beginning with the class that started last Saturday. I understand it's 32 weeks now. We had no academy facility. We had a very small classroom, auditorium type thing that held our classes in the Kenilworth location. We had no gym, nothing else separate from it. Every police office in this building, including quartermaster, evidence, crime lab, central records, and even our own print shop, would fit into that building, which was about the size of a current modern-day library in Baltimore County with a basement. Our district court, for me anyway, was in the basement of a high store on Philadelphia Road. Not exaggerating. It was okay until the milk delivery came. And then you could hear the sound like the ceiling crushing in. More extraordinary, we had my first precinct facility was a multi-purpose type building throughout history. It was originally a liquor store, converted to a magistrate's court and then to a police station without the benefit of a cell block. But we did have a steel support post in the middle of the open area where the desk sergeant was, and that's where we handcuffed prisoners to hold for processing. That's the old Fullerton station. I guess the county still owns it. I'm not sure exactly what it's used for. 50 years ago, 1974, the police budget was $18.8 million. I understand this past year, current fiscal, it's about $260 million. I guess we'll find out the results of today, what it's going to be at for the next fiscal year. Okay, no doubt. Appreciate what you have, knowing eventually things do change. Now, these are the tangible items I mentioned. Let me talk about the intangible. I entered the police department when public sentiment did not see policing in the most favorable light. Old-timers would remember that. We had civil disorders, demonstrations, Vietnam War protests, and very frequent attacks on police officers. During a so-called war on drugs, when there was a drug revolution going on. The tone was anti-establishment, and the police were seen as the establishment. This then evolved into the campaign slogan of the early 70s, the national campaign of law and order. It's broadcast everywhere. Society saw the repercussions of the anti-police movement, increased crime and smaller recruitment candidate pool. Sounds familiar. History does repeat itself. This evolved into efforts to recruit police. One benefit offered by the federal government was the Law Enforcement Education Assistance Program, in which recruits would have a guaranteed payback on their college tuition. If you committed to 4 years of service, 25% was paid for each year. It was not a lot different than what has happened in recent years with calls to defund, create more restrictions, and removing due process for officers, as seen in the abolishment of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. The Law Enforcement Bill of Rights worked well but was abolished because it was construed as an excessive entitlement by those obviously not aware of the process and its application. In reality, it is little more than a set of due process procedures applied to administrative allegations of neglect and misconduct, not for criminal misconduct by police. People working in internal affairs would have known that. In Baltimore County, it was applied successfully for over 50 years. The abolishment of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights is a detrimental change in the current police environment. It's an example of not learning from history. I hope future legislators see the error and fix it. For those currently in the profession, know that policing has adjusted to similar movements over the 150 years. So don't be discouraged by political whims or persuasions from the extremes. Focus on doing the right thing in the right way for the right reason. Take pride in what you do and service to others. I'm not going to dwell on the police environment of today, because that would probably take another 20 minutes, except to say that it is still evolving and will always evolve. Policing in a free society requires that the profession adjust to changes imposed by its society, the courts, as well as local, state, and federal legislators. While change is constant, what we consistently have are members of a profession, both sworn and non-sworn, with a commitment to service and integrity that overshadows the extreme few who fall short of that. Policing is often the art and science of being all things to all people. It has evolved to that because when all the social and government institutions intended to create a cohesive society fail, the burden of picking up the pieces falls on the police officer who gets the 911 call and walks up to the door. It seems contradictory to call police officers first responders, when in reality, they show up when everything else has failed, such as the family, education, mental health care, drug policies, the criminal justice system, and yes, at times, policing itself. I, for one, am very fortunate to know many department members from the generation before me, those who I served alongside, and the generation following mine. Together, we have a legacy to be very proud of. The most important legacy of our department, well beyond equipment and trends, as repeated already by Chief Sheridan, is you, each and every member of this department, past and present and future. And then there are those who gave all. Officer Ed Kuznar, Officer Charles Huckabee, Corporal Sam Snyder, Officer Robert Zimmerman, Sergeant Bruce Prothero. I didn't think this was going to happen. Sergeant John Stem, Sergeant Mark Perry, Lieutenant Mike Howe, Officer Jason Schneider, Officer Amy Sorrells Caprio. Her mom was here earlier and had to leave. Never forget them. To the generation before me, thank you for what you gave us. For those of my generation, thanks for being there with me. We had a great ride. For the current generation, make a difference and leave it better for those following in your footsteps. Thank you very much. Oops.